Hey guys, tonight we begin with a goose. Yes, you heard that right. A single goose that nearly plunged medieval France into absolute chaos and bloodshed. One feathered fool with an attitude problem almost rewrote European history because, apparently, even waterfowl had diplomatic immunity in the 14th century. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together into a world where poultry politics could literally start wars. Let's start with the biggest misconception about medieval conflicts. Most people think medieval wars started over noble causes, disputed thrones, religious differences, territorial ambitions, or defending family honor. You know, the stuff of epic poems in Hollywood movies. In reality, medieval Europeans would go to war over literally anything that bruised their fragile egos, including but not limited to whose horse was prettier, who made better cheese, whether someone's coat of arms looked too much like someone else's coat of arms. And yes, the treatment of livestock, think of it like modern social media drama. Except instead of angry tweets and cancel culture, you got actual siege warfare and people dying of dysentery in muddy fields. This wasn't some romanticized age of chivalrous knights gallantly defending damsels in distress. It was more like a continent, full of overgrown toddlers with access to sharp weapons and way too much free time. Medieval nobility had the emotional maturity of reality TV stars and the military resources to actually do something catastrophic about their hurt feelings. They'd start decades-long blood feuds because someone's great-uncle allegedly insulted someone else's great-aunt at a wedding 40 years ago. So, when I tell you that a goose nearly started a war, I want you to remember that these are the same people who once went to war because two neighboring lords couldn't agree on the proper pronunciation of a Latin phrase during Mass. The year was 1347, and France wasn't the unified nation you might imagine. It was more like a patchwork quilt sewn together by a blind person having a seizure, a collection of duchies, counties and petty kingdoms all theoretically owing allegiance to the French crown, but in practice doing whatever they damn well pleased. The northern regions weren't some pastoral paradise of rolling hills and happy peasants. They were a political powder keg where every minor noble thought they were the star of their own personal soap opera. The Duke of Normandy controlled vast swaths of territory and had the ego to match, while the Count of Flanders sat smugly in his prosperous trading towns, convinced that his wealth made him untouchable. Between them lay a dozen smaller lordships, each ruled by men who had inherited both land and an inexplicable conviction that they were God's gift to medieval politics. If you thought managing a homeowners association was difficult, try imagine herding cats, except the cats have armies and hereditary grievances dating back to Charlemagne. The church supposedly provided moral guidance, but medieval priests were about as morally consistent as modern politicians. They preached peace on Sunday and blessed weapons of war on Monday. Trade routes crisscrossed the region like arteries, pumping wealth and gossip in equal measure. And where you had merchants, you had disputes. Where you had disputes, you had nobles looking for excuses to prove their masculinity through violence. This was also the height of what historians politely call feudal particularism, which is a fancy way of saying everybody was convinced they were in charge of everything within a 50-mile radius of their castle. Legal jurisdiction was about as clear as mud after a rainstorm. One lord's territory might include Tuesday and Thursday justice, while his neighbor handled weekend disputes. And don't even get me started on who was supposed to deal with crimes committed on religious holidays. Into this delightful mess of competing egos and unclear authority stumbled our feathered protagonist, blissfully unaware that she was about to become the Helen of Troy of medieval poultry. And if you think that's ridiculous, wait until you hear about the legal precedent involving a pig that was put on trial for murder. But that's another story entirely. Meet Marguerite the Goose, though she obviously didn't name herself, being a goose and all. Marguerite belonged to Brother Aldrich, a monk at the Abbey of St. Bertrand, which sat inconveniently right on the border between the lands of Duke William of Normandy and Count Thierry of Flanders. Now, Brother Aldrich was what you might charitably call eccentric, and what you might more accurately call completely bonkers. He had convinced himself that his geese possessed prophetic abilities and could predict everything from the weather to the outcome of military campaigns. This wasn't entirely unusual. Medieval people believed in all sorts of nonsense, including that hedgehogs could predict the sex of unborn children, and that eating too many eggs would make you grow feathers. But Brother Aldrich took his goose obsession to new levels. He'd built elaborate shrines to his birds, claimed they could speak Latin, and insisted that Marguerite in particular had been blessed by Saint Francis himself. The other monks thought he was nuts, but hey, the geese laid good eggs and kept the monastery gardens free of pests, so they let crazy Uncle Aldrich do his thing. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean spectacularly stupid. Marguerite had developed a habit of wandering off the monastery grounds to graze in the lush meadows that technically belonged to Duke William. This wasn't unusual. Livestock wandered all the time, and most reasonable people would just shoo them back where they belonged. But Duke William wasn't most people. He was a man who once challenged his own cousin to a duel because the cousin suggested that William's mustache made him look like a walrus. The Duke's response to trespassing geese was to post guards around his meadows with orders to kill any unauthorized livestock, not capture and return, kill. Because apparently, in William's mind, property rights extended to the summary execution of waterfowl. His justification was that these weren't just any geese. They were monastic geese, and therefore represented an infringement of ecclesiastical authority on his secular domain. In other words, he was having a territorial pissing contest with monks over a bird. Meanwhile, Count Thierry caught wind of this goose drama and saw an opportunity to mess with his rival. Thierry was the type of medieval lord who would show up uninvited to your wedding, just to loudly announce that he thought your bride was ugly and your castle needed better defenses. He publicly declared that any harm to the sacred geese of St. Bertrand would be considered an act of aggression against the church and, by extension, against him as a defender of the faith. So now we had Brother Aldrich insisting his goose was holy, Duke William treating livestock trespass like a declaration of war, and Count Thierry positioning himself as the defender of religious poultry rights. And poor Marguerite just wanted to eat some grass that happened to be slightly greener on the other side of an imaginary line, drawn by humans she neither knew nor cared about. This wasn't just about agricultural property rights or even religious symbolism. The goose incident, as it came to be known in hushed whispers throughout the region, represented everything that was dysfunctional about medieval politics rolled into one absurd package. At its heart, this was a proxy war between two powerful men who had been looking for an excuse to go at each other for years. Duke William saw this as a test of his authority. If he couldn't keep a single goose off his land, how could he be expected to maintain order among his human subjects? In his mind, every peasant, merchant, and minor noble was watching to see if the Duke would enforce his boundaries or be made a fool of by a bird. His reputation as a strong leader was apparently so fragile that it could be shattered by waterfowl. Count Thierry, meanwhile, recognized this as the perfect opportunity to embarrass his rival while positioning himself as a defender of religious institutions. Medieval lords were constantly trying to outdo each other in displays of piety, And protecting holy geese was exactly the kind of bizarre gesture that would make him look good to the church hierarchy. Plus, anything that made Duke William look ridiculous was a win in Thierry's book. But the real stakes were much higher than two men's egos. The region was already tense with trade disputes, marriage negotiations gone wrong, and the usual collection of inherited grudges that made medieval politics so delightfully insane. A military confrontation between William and Thierry wouldn't stay contained. Their various allies, enemies, and opportunistic neighbors would inevitably get drawn in, turning a goose-related skirmish into a full-scale regional war. And let's be honest here, people were going to die over this. Real human beings with families and dreams, and probably much more common sense than their lords, were going to get skewered with pointy sticks, because two grown men couldn't figure out how to share a meadow with a goose. But Marguerite the Goose was just the beginning of this medieval comedy of errors. What started as a simple case of livestock trespass was about to spiral into a diplomatic crisis that would involve papal intervention, military mobilization, and enough legal technicalities to make a modern lawyer weep with joy. The real drama was only just beginning, because it turns out that medieval people had an absolutely incredible talent for taking simple problems and turning them into mind-bogglingly complex disasters. What should have been a 5-minute conversation between reasonable adults was about to become a months-long saga involving international law, religious doctrine, and enough wounded pride to fuel a Shakespeare tragedy. And here's the beautiful irony. While Duke William and Count Thierry were preparing to spill blood over the principle of the thing, Marguerite herself remained blissfully unaware that she had become the most famous goose in Europe. She continued her daily routine of eating, sleeping, and occasionally making that horrible honking noise that geese make, completely oblivious to the fact that armies were being assembled in her honor. So, buckle up, because we're about to dive into the wonderfully ridiculous world of medieval diplomatic protocol, where the treatment of a single bird could threaten the peace of nations, and where grown men with access to siege weapons took their poultry very, very seriously. The concept of sacred property rights in medieval Europe was about as straightforward as a hedge maze designed by a drunk person. Unlike our modern understanding of property ownership, where you buy something, you own it, and other people generally can't just wander onto your land and set up camp. Medieval property law was a delightful mess of overlapping jurisdictions, inherited claims, and religious exemptions that would make a tax attorney's head spin. See, when Brother Aldrich's geese wandered onto Duke William's land, they weren't just trespassing livestock. In the Byzantine world of medieval law, they were ecclesiastical property operating under divine protection, which theoretically gave them different legal status than regular barnyard animals. It's like if your neighbor's cat had diplomatic immunity because it belonged to an embassy, except the embassy was God, and the cat was a goose, and everyone involved was taking this way too seriously. The church had spent centuries carving out legal exceptions for its property, partly for legitimate religious reasons, and partly because medieval bishops were just as power-hungry as secular lords and wanted their own special rules. Monastic animals weren't just livestock. They were instruments of divine will, or some such theological nonsense. This meant that harming them wasn't just property damage. It was technically sacrilege, which carried much heavier penalties and gave the church grounds to get involved in what should have been a simple civil dispute. But here's where it gets really stupid. The definition of ecclesiastical property was about as clear as soup. Did it include only animals specifically blessed by a priest? Animals that lived on church grounds? Animals owned by religious people? Animals that happened to be in the vicinity when someone said a prayer? Nobody really knew, and medieval lawyers, yes, they had lawyers, and yes, they were just as awful, as you'd expect, made fortunes arguing about these distinctions. Take the infamous Case of the Blessed Chickens of Cluny from 1298. The abbot of Cluny claimed that his monastery's entire chicken population was holy because they had been consecrated during a special ceremony involving a relic of St. Peter, when a local lord's hunting dogs killed 3 of these allegedly sacred chickens during a chase. The abbot demanded not just compensation for the birds, but also that the dogs be executed for the sin of killing blessed animals. The case dragged on for 7 years. 7 years. Over 3 dead chickens. Lawyers from across France descended on the region like vultures, each armed with conflicting interpretations of canon law, Roman law, and local customs. Some argued that chickens couldn't be truly blessed because they lacked rational souls. Others insisted that blessing transferred through proximity, making every animal within a mile of the monastery technically holy. One particularly creative legal scholar suggested that the dogs should be tried for heresy, since they had presumably acted with malicious intent against God's creatures. The final verdict? The dogs were declared innocent because animals cannot sin, but their owner had to pay triple damages for failing to properly control instruments of divine wrath. The chickens were ruled retroactively blessed, but only on Sundays and feast days. I wish I was making this up. Another delightful example involved the pig trial of Falaise in 1386, where an actual pig was put on trial for murdering a child. The pig was assigned a defense attorney, dressed in human clothes for the trial, and ultimately sentenced to death by hanging. But here's the kicker. The pig's piglets were initially charged as accomplices, then acquitted because the judge decided they were too young to understand the gravity of infanticide. The court records still exist, and they're written with the same serious legal language you'd expect for a human murder trial. These weren't isolated incidents of medieval weirdness. In 1457, a mother sow and her 6 piglets were charged with murder in Burgundy. The sow was convicted and hanged, but the piglets got off on a technicality because they were of tender age and had been led astray by their mother's bad example. The court actually debated whether pigs could experience moral corruption and whether baby pigs could be held responsible for following their mother's criminal behavior. But perhaps the most ridiculous case was the Great Locust Excommunication of 1338, when a swarm of locusts destroyed crops throughout southern France. The Bishop of Autun actually excommunicated the entire species. He issued a formal decree banishing all locusts from his diocese and threatening them with eternal damnation if they didn't leave within 3 days. When the locusts failed to comply, shocking, I know, the bishop declared that their continued presence proved they were agents of Satan and authorized a holy war against insects. The locust campaign involved formal military units, blessed weapons, and detailed battle plans for fighting creatures roughly the size of your thumb. Knights rode out in full armor to combat bugs. They built siege engines designed to launch holy water at swarms. Prayer warriors chanted Latin at grasshoppers. It was like watching someone try to perform brain surgery with a sledgehammer, except the brain was a locust and the sledgehammer was the entire feudal military system. But it wasn't that simple, because medieval law never is. The same legal system that granted special protection to monastic geese also recognized the absolute property rights of secular lords within their domains. Duke William wasn't just being a jerk when he claimed authority over his meadows. He was operating under centuries of legal precedent that made lords responsible for everything that happened on their land, from taxation to justice to pest control. Medieval property ownership came with obligations as well as rights. If bandits used William's meadows as a hideout, he was liable for their crimes. If diseased animals grazed there and spread plague, he could be held responsible for public health violations. If foreign merchants were robbed while crossing his territory, their governments might demand compensation from him personally. So, From William's perspective, allowing unauthorized animals, even holy ones, to use his land without permission was setting a dangerous precedent. Then there was the question of competing jurisdictions. The monastery claimed ecclesiastical authority over its geese wherever they went, like some kind of medieval diplomatic immunity. But Count Thierry also claimed protective authority over religious institutions in his territory, which technically included the Abbey of St. Bertrand. Meanwhile, the local bishop insisted that all questions involving blessed animals fell under canon law and should be decided by church courts, not secular ones. So whose law applied? Church law, which protected the geese. Norman law, which gave Duke William absolute authority over his property. Flemish law, which granted Count Thierry jurisdiction over religious disputes. Royal French law, which theoretically superseded all local customs. Roman law, which scholars kept insisting was still relevant despite the Roman Empire being dead for centuries. Or local customary law, which varied from village to village and was mostly made up as people went along. The answer, predictably, was that everyone claimed their law was the right law, and nobody was willing to back down. It was like playing a board game where every player insists they're using different rules. Except the board game was medieval Europe, and the pieces were actual human beings with sharp weapons and strong opinions about waterfowl. Medieval lawyers. And yes, they were already parasites even then. Rubbed their hands together with glee. Here was a case that involved property law, religious law, international law, animal law, and probably maritime law if they squinted hard enough. They could drag this out for decades, billing all parties involved while contributing absolutely nothing to resolving the actual dispute. The result was predictably chaotic. Duke William, tired of legal technicalities and convinced that his authority was being undermined by a bird, decided to take direct action. He issued a proclamation declaring all unauthorized animals on his property to be enemies of the realm, and authorized his guards to kill them on sight. This wasn't just about geese anymore. He was essentially declaring war on any creature that couldn't produce proper documentation of its right to exist on his land. Brother Aldrich responded by doing what medieval monks did best. He wrote strongly, worded letters, lots of them, to the Duke, to Count Thierry, to the Bishop, to the Pope, to the King of France, and probably to anyone else who could read Latin and had an opinion about poultry rights. In these letters, he claimed that Marguerite wasn't just any goose. She was a messenger of divine will, whose wanderings were guided by God himself. According to Brother Aldrich, preventing Marguerite from grazing wherever she pleased was tantamount to interfering with God's plan for the universe. Count Thierry saw an opportunity and pounced on it like a cat on a particularly slow mouse. He publicly declared himself the protector of sacred geese, and announced that any harm to Brother Aldrich's birds would be considered an act of war against Flanders. He wasn't doing this out of deep religious conviction or love of waterfowl. He was doing it because embarrassing Duke William was always good politics. And defender of holy animals was the kind of ridiculous title that would make great propaganda. The local population reacted with a mixture of bewilderment and opportunism. Peasants started claiming their own livestock was blessed in hopes of gaining legal protection from noble interference. Merchants began charging extra fees for transporting ecclesiastical animals across territorial boundaries. Con artists set up fake blessing ceremonies, promising to make your chickens legally untouchable for a small fee. The church hierarchy was deeply divided. Progressive bishops argued that God's love extended to all creatures and that protecting animals was a Christian duty. Conservative bishops insisted that granting legal rights to livestock was theological nonsense that undermined human authority over creation. Moderate bishops tried to find a middle ground, suggesting that maybe some animals could be a little bit blessed, but not too blessed, and only on weekdays. Meanwhile, neighboring lords watched this circus with a mixture of amusement and concern. If Duke William and Count Thierry actually went to war over a goose, the conflict would inevitably spread as various allies honored their treaties and opportunists seized the chance to settle old scores. What started as a property dispute between two men was threatening to become a regional catastrophe involving thousands of people who probably couldn't even locate the disputed meadow on a map. Meanwhile, the legal scholars were having the time of their lives. This case had everything they loved: ancient precedents, conflicting authorities, theological implications, and enough loopholes to keep them employed until the Second Coming. Universities across Europe began incorporating the goose question into their curricula, and law students practiced arguing both sides of the divine waterfowl protection debate. But while lawyers debated and nobles postured, Marguerite herself remained blissfully unaware of her starring role in this medieval soap opera. She continued her simple routine of eating, sleeping, and producing eggs, occasionally stopping to clean her feathers or chase off other birds who got too close to her favorite grazing spots. If she had any opinion about international law or ecclesiastical property rights, she kept it to herself. The absurdity was about to reach new heights, because medieval Europeans had a special talent for taking already ridiculous situations and somehow making them even more ridiculous. What started as a simple trespassing incident was evolving into a diplomatic crisis that would test the very foundations of feudal society, and nobody seemed capable of stepping back and asking the obvious question: are we really going to fight a war over a goose? The answer, it seemed, was yes. Yes, they absolutely were. If the legal complexities of sacred property rights were a carnival of medieval absurdity, then the political machinations that followed were a full-blown circus complete, with clowns, tightrope walkers, and the occasional lion trying to eat everyone involved. What started as a dispute over grazing rights had morphed into something far more dangerous, a test of feudal loyalty systems that were already held together with little more than personal pride and the medieval equivalent of pinky promises. See, medieval politics weren't like modern democracy where you vote for candidates and complain about them on social media. Medieval politics were more like a massive game of Red Rover played with armies, where everyone was constantly trying to figure out who was on whose side, who owed what to whom, and whether that alliance your grandfather made 50 years ago was still technically binding now that everyone involved was dead. Duke William and Count Thierry weren't just two guys arguing about a goose. They were nodes in a complex web of feudal obligations that stretched across Europe like a particularly unstable house of cards. William owed allegiance to the King of France, but also had ties to English nobility through marriage. Thierry was technically a vassal of the French crown too, but his wealth from Flemish trade routes made him practically independent, and he had his own network of allies who were getting very interested in this goose situation. The problem with feudal loyalty was that it was based on personal relationships rather than institutional structures. When Lord A had a dispute with Lord B, it wasn't just their problem. It was potentially everyone's problem, because Lord A's allies were honor-bound to support him, and Lord B's allies were honor-bound to support him. And pretty soon you had people who couldn't find the disputed territory on a map preparing for war, because their great-uncle once swore an oath to somebody's cousin. This became relevant to our goose crisis, because both William and Thierry started calling in favors, and when medieval nobles start calling in favors, things get complicated very quickly. Consider the curious case of Sir Bertrand de Montfort, a minor lord who owed military service to Duke William but whose sister was married to one of Count Thierry's nephews. When the Duke issued his call for supporters in the sacred geese matter, Sir Bertrand found himself in the medieval equivalent of being asked to choose sides in a divorce between your best friends. According to feudal law, Bertrand owed 40 days of military service per year to Duke William. But family obligations were also sacred in medieval society, and opposing his sisters-in-laws could create a blood feud that would last generations. Bertrand's solution was typically medieval in its creative stupidity. He declared that he would fulfill his military obligation to the Duke by providing soldiers to protect the Duke's property from all threats except geese, which fell under a different category of service that he would need to negotiate separately. This wasn't just Bertrand being difficult. He was trying to thread the needle of competing loyalties in a system that wasn't designed for nuanced positions. But his compromise satisfied no one. Duke William interpreted it as disrespect to his authority. Count Thierry saw it as a half-hearted commitment to animal welfare. Bertrand's own knights were confused about whether they were supposed to fight geese, protect geese, or pretend geese didn't exist. And his wife started sleeping in the guest chamber because she was tired of being married to a man whose military strategy was apparently designed by a committee of drunk philosophers. Then there was the Archbishop of Reims, who really should have stayed out of the whole mess but couldn't resist the opportunity to demonstrate his political relevance. The Archbishop had been trying for years to mediate between various feuding nobles, partly out of genuine Christian duty, and partly because successful diplomacy enhanced his prestige with the papal court. When he heard about the Goose Crisis, he saw it as the perfect opportunity to establish himself as the great peacemaker of northern France. His intervention began promisingly enough. The Archbishop invited both Duke William and Count Thierry to a peace conference at his cathedral, where they could resolve their differences through prayer, negotiation, and presumably some kind of binding agreement about goose management. He even commissioned a special prayer for the occasion, asking God to grant wisdom to those who govern, compassion to those who serve, and proper grazing habits to those who waddle. But the Archbishop made one crucial mistake. He invited Brother Aldrich to attend the conference with Marguerite herself, thinking that seeing the actual goose in question would help humanize the dispute. This was like bringing a lit match to a gunpowder factory. The moment Marguerite waddled into the cathedral, the entire carefully orchestrated diplomatic event devolved into chaos. Duke William took one look at the goose and declared that bringing livestock into a sacred space was sacrilege. Count Thierry countered that excluding God's creatures from God's house was the real sacrilege. Brother Aldrich started preaching about the spiritual significance of waterfowl. The Archbishop tried to maintain order while secretly wondering if his career in diplomacy was over before it started. And Marguerite, apparently overwhelmed by the acoustics of the cathedral, began honking at the top of her lungs during what was supposed to be a moment of silent prayer. The conference ended with Duke William storming out, Count Thierry declaring the whole thing a farce, and the Archbishop seriously considering a career change. Brother Aldrich stayed behind to apologize for his goose's behavior, explaining that she was normally much better behaved, but had been nervous about the formal setting. The Archbishop, showing remarkable restraint, simply blessed the goose and suggested that future diplomatic meetings might be more successful in outdoor venues. But perhaps the most telling incident involved the Merchant Guild of Bruges, who had significant trade relationships with both Duke William and Count Thierry. The guild initially tried to stay neutral in the goose dispute, issuing a carefully worded statement expressing support for all parties involved in seeking a peaceful resolution to agricultural property concerns. But neutrality in medieval politics was like trying to stay dry in the rain. Theoretically possible, but practically impossible. Count Thierry interpreted the guild's neutrality as insufficient support for his position as defender of sacred animals. He threatened to impose additional tariffs on Bruges merchants trading in Norman territory. Duke William, not to be outdone, suggested that the guild's failure to condemn goose Trespassing showed they were soft on property rights and might not be reliable trading partners. Within weeks, the guild found themselves forced to choose sides. In a conflict they'd tried desperately to avoid, all because they'd refused to take a position on medieval poultry politics. This wasn't an isolated case of feudal loyalty systems breaking down over ridiculous disputes. Medieval Europe was littered with examples of minor disagreements, escalating into major conflicts because the political structure was fundamentally designed to turn every disagreement into a test of honor and allegiance. Take the War of the Breton Succession, which lasted over 20 years, partly because two women claimed the same inheritance and partly because every major power in Europe decided this was a perfect opportunity to settle unrelated grudges. Or consider the various succession crises in the Holy Roman Empire, where disputes over who got to wear a fancy hat led to decades of warfare across Central Europe. Medieval politics were like a game of dominoes played by people who kept adding more dominoes and couldn't agree on which direction they were supposed to fall. The pattern was always the same. Minor dispute leads to honor being questioned. Honor being questioned leads to allies being called upon. Allies being called upon leads to counter-alliances forming. And counter-alliances forming leads to everyone forgetting what they were fighting about in the first place. It was like watching a bar fight escalate into a riot. Except the bar was Europe, and the fight could last for generations. What made the Goose Crisis particularly dangerous was that it hit all the trigger points simultaneously: property rights, religious authority, feudal obligations, family loyalties, trade relationships, and wounded pride were all involved. It was a perfect storm of medieval dysfunction, and everyone involved seemed determined to make it worse rather than better. The feudal system was supposed to provide stability through clear hierarchies and mutual obligations. In theory, everyone knew their place, everyone knew their duties, and disputes could be resolved through established channels. In practice, it was more like a Rube Goldberg machine designed by committee, incredibly complex, probably dangerous, and guaranteed to break down in spectacular fashion at the worst possible moment. Medieval nobles had spent centuries developing elaborate codes of honor and chivalry specifically to avoid these kinds of escalating conflicts. But honor codes are only as good as the people following them, and medieval nobles were about as good at following rules as modern politicians are at keeping campaign promises. They'd invoke honor when it suited them, ignore it when it didn't, and constantly reinterpret it to justify whatever they wanted to do anyway. The effects of this loyalty system breakdown were far-reaching and ridiculous in equal measure. Duke William, faced with what he perceived as insufficient support from his vassals, began questioning the loyalty of everyone in his service. Knights who had served his family for generations suddenly found themselves under suspicion because they hadn't been enthusiastic enough about goose-related military service. Servants were interrogated about their opinions on waterfowl property rights. Even the castle chaplain was asked to preach sermons about the theological implications of livestock trespass. Count Thierry, meanwhile, was discovering that being the self-proclaimed protector of sacred geese was more complicated than he'd anticipated. Religious orders throughout his territory began requesting protection for their animals, leading to a bureaucratic nightmare of determining which creatures qualified for divine protection and which were just regular farm animals. His court was flooded with requests to bless everything from cattle to chickens, to one particularly optimistic request involving a pet ferret. The merchant classes, who had initially seen the whole thing as amusing entertainment, were beginning to realize that trade routes were being disrupted by nobles who couldn't agree on goose management. Caravans were being stopped at borders and questioned about their cargo, not because anyone suspected smuggling, but because guards wanted to make sure they weren't transporting any unauthorized sacred waterfowl. The price of legitimate geese skyrocketed as demand increased for birds with proper ecclesiastical documentation. But perhaps most significantly, the goose crisis was exposing fundamental weaknesses in the feudal system that clever observers were filing away for future reference. When a single wandering bird could threaten the stability of international relationships, it suggested that maybe basing your entire political structure on personal honor and inherited obligations wasn't the most practical approach to governance. Younger nobles, especially those who had been educated in the new universities popping up across Europe, began privately questioning whether their elders were taking this whole feudalism thing a bit too seriously. It was hard to maintain respect for a system of government that could be derailed by poultry, and some of the more progressive thinkers were beginning to wonder if there might be better ways to organize society. The church hierarchy was also taking notes. If ecclesiastical property rights could be used to manipulate secular politics this easily, it suggested new strategies for expanding church influence. Several bishops began quietly encouraging their monasteries to acquire more livestock, just in case future disputes required some holy animals to complicate matters. Yet even as the political ramifications of the goose crisis spread throughout the region like ripples in a pond, the legal establishment was preparing to escalate matters to an entirely new level of absurdity. What had started as a property dispute and evolved into a loyalty crisis was about to become a full-blown constitutional crisis involving the fundamental nature of sovereignty, divine right, and whether waterfowl could be considered legal persons. Under canon law, the University of Paris had dispatched its most prominent legal scholars to study the case, not because they cared about geese, but because the precedents being set could reshape European jurisprudence for centuries. Meanwhile, representatives from the papal court were quietly making their way north, ostensibly to mediate the dispute, but actually to assess whether this situation could be used to expand church authority over secular matters. And through it all, Marguerite continued her daily routine of grazing, swimming, and being generally goose-like, completely oblivious to the fact that she had become the most legally significant bird in European history. Her simple desire for better grass had set in motion a chain of events that was about to test whether medieval civilization could survive its own bureaucratic complexity, and the answer was looking increasingly uncertain. By the autumn of 1347, the goose incident had reached a breaking point that would have made Greek tragedians weep with envy. What had started as a simple case of wandering livestock had metastasized into a full-blown international crisis involving papal legates, royal intervention, and enough wounded pride to fuel a dozen Shakespearean dramas. The tension in northern France was so thick you could cut it with a sword, which, incidentally, several people were seriously considering doing. Duke William had assembled what he grandly called the Army of Righteous Property Defense, which consisted of about 300 knights, twice as many men-at-arms, and a siege engine that someone had optimistically named Goose Crusher. The Duke's War Council had developed detailed battle plans for what they were calling Operation Sacred Meadow, complete with flanking maneuvers, supply lines, and contingency plans for fighting in weather conditions ranging from light drizzle to apocalyptic storm. Count Thierry, not to be outdone in the medieval arms race, had raised the Holy Alliance for the protection of divine creatures, a slightly smaller but arguably more motivated force that included several genuine religious zealots who believed they were literally fighting for God's favorite waterfowl. Thierry's knights had taken to wearing goose feathers in their helmets as a badge of honor, which would have been inspiring if it weren't so completely ridiculous. The stakes had escalated far beyond anyone's original intentions. Duke William's reputation as a strong leader was now tied to his ability to keep a single goose off his property. Count Thierry's credibility as a defender of the faith depended on protecting an animal that most people considered a glorified dinner ingredient. Both men had invested so much political capital in this dispute that backing down would be tantamount to admitting they were the kind of leaders who could be defeated by poultry. Meanwhile, King Philip VI of France was getting increasingly frantic. Reports about two of his most powerful vassals preparing for war over what his courtiers kept describing as the goose thing. The king had his own problems. The English were making threatening noises about their claims to French territory. The plague was starting to appear in Mediterranean ports, and now he had to deal with the possibility of civil war breaking out. Because two grown men couldn't share a meadow with a bird. The moment that pushed this medieval farce over the edge into actual crisis occurred on October 13th, 1347, a date that would live in infamy among students of absurd historical events. Brother Aldrich, perhaps sensing that the political situation was spiraling out of control, had decided to take matters into his own hands by attempting what he called a divine intervention to resolve the crisis peacefully. His plan was simple, in the way that only a plan conceived by a man who talked to geese could be simple. He would bring Marguerite to the disputed meadow at dawn, allow her to graze freely while he performed a blessing ceremony, and thereby demonstrate to all involved parties that God clearly intended for this particular piece of land to be shared harmoniously between secular and religious interests. It was the kind of plan that sounds reasonable if you don't think about it too hard, and completely insane if you do. What Brother Aldrich hadn't counted on was that both Duke William and Count Thierry had been having the same meadow watched around the clock by armed guards who had been given very specific instructions about unauthorized activities. So, when the monk showed up at sunrise with his famous goose and began setting up what looked suspiciously like a religious ceremony on disputed territory, he inadvertently created exactly the kind of provocation that everyone had been trying to avoid. The Duke's guards, led by a sergeant named Hugo, who took his duties very seriously and his thinking not seriously at all, interpreted the blessing ceremony as an act of ecclesiastical aggression designed to establish permanent church claim to the meadow. Hugo's response was to march over and demand that Brother Aldrich cease his illegal occupation of ducal property and remove his contraband waterfowl immediately. Brother Aldrich, who had spent so much time talking to geese that he'd apparently forgotten how to talk to humans, responded by explaining that he was performing a divinely mandated ceremony of territorial reconciliation, and that interrupting it would bring down God's wrath on all involved parties. He also mentioned, somewhat unhelpfully, that Marguerite had personally requested this particular grazing spot in what he claimed was a prophetic dream he'd had the previous Tuesday while this theological discussion was taking place. Count Thierry's scouts, who had been watching the Duke's guards watching the meadow, observed armed men confronting a monk and immediately assumed this was the beginning of William's long-threatened crackdown on religious freedom. Their captain, a man named Zhang, who had been looking for an excuse to prove his devotion to the cause of sacred geese, ordered his men to rescue the Holy Brother and his divine fowl from secular persecution. What happened next was like watching a Rube Goldberg machine designed by someone with a grudge against common sense. Jean's men charged toward the meadow to protect Brother Aldrich. Hugo's guards, seeing armed men approaching, assumed they were under attack and prepared to defend their position. Brother Aldrich, caught in the middle, began shouting prayers in Latin while Marguerite, startled by all the commotion, began honking loudly and flapping her wings in what everyone interpreted as either divine approval or divine outrage, depending on their political alignment. The first actual violence occurred when one of Thierry's knights, Sir Roland de Flanders, attempted to place himself between Hugo's guards and Brother Aldrich as a gesture of protection. Hugo, interpreting this as an aggressive move, drew his sword and demanded that Roland stand down. Roland, who had been trained since childhood to never back down from a challenge involving his honor, drew his own sword and declared that he would defend God's creatures against all enemies of righteousness. The resulting sword fight was brief, clumsy, and watched by approximately 30 armed men who weren't entirely sure whose side they were supposed to be on. Roland managed to give Hugo a shallow cut on his sword arm before Hugo's backup arrived and wrestled the Flemish knight to the ground. No one was seriously injured, but in medieval politics, the severity of wounds mattered less than the fact that blood had been shed over a point of honor. Brother Aldrich, meanwhile, had scooped up Marguerite and was trying to retreat to neutral ground while loudly proclaiming that violence in the presence of blessed animals was surely a mortal sin. His exit was complicated by the fact that Marguerite, apparently excited by all the drama, had escaped his arms and was now waddling around the meadow honking triumphantly, as if she were personally declaring victory over the forces of secular oppression. The scene concluded with both sides retreating to defensive positions, while shouting accusations at each other across the disputed meadow. Hugo's men claimed they had been attacked while lawfully defending ducal property. Jean's men insisted they had been protecting religious freedom from military aggression. Brother Aldrich declared that the whole incident proved his point about the need for divine intervention, and Marguerite continued grazing peacefully, apparently unaware that she had just witnessed the first battle of what historians would later call the most ridiculous military confrontation in European history. The response to what became known as the Meadow incident was swift and completely disproportionate to the actual events. Duke William, upon hearing that his men had been assaulted by Flemish aggressors while performing their lawful duties, immediately declared that this unprovoked attack constituted an act of war against Normandy. He dispatched formal challenges to Count Thierry, began mobilizing his full military forces, and issued proclamations calling on all loyal vassals to prepare for a righteous campaign against the enemies of property rights and civilized governance. Count Thierry's reaction was equally measured and reasonable, which is to say he completely lost his mind. He declared that the attack on Brother Aldrich represented nothing less than a declaration of war against God himself, issued counter-challenges to Duke William, and began writing letters to every religious authority in Europe, describing the Norman aggression against holy monks and their sacred charges. His propaganda campaign portrayed the Meadow incident as the beginning of a secular assault on Christian values, with Marguerite cast in the role of an innocent martyr for religious freedom. Brother Aldrich, perhaps realizing that his peace mission had accomplished the exact opposite of its intended purpose, retreated to his monastery and began a marathon prayer session for divine forgiveness. He also wrote detailed accounts of the incident to every church official he could think of, carefully emphasizing that he had been performing a blessing ceremony when he was surrounded by armed men who showed no respect for sacred rituals or divine creatures. His letters made no mention of the fact that he had failed to obtain permission from anyone before performing religious ceremonies on disputed territory. The immediate military consequences were both predictable and absurd. Within days, both sides had established armed camps within sight of each other, separated by the famous meadow that was now effectively a no-man's land patrolled by soldiers who had been ordered to prevent unauthorized grazing while maintaining defensive positions against possible enemy advances. It was like watching two armies prepare for siege warfare over a patch of grass that was probably worth about 3 silver coins on a good day. The political fallout spread throughout the region. Like plague through a medieval city, minor nobles who had been trying to stay neutral were forced to choose sides, either joining Duke William's coalition for property rights or Count Thierry's alliance for religious freedom. Trade relationships that had existed for generations were suddenly strained as merchants found themselves having to navigate the political implications of goose-related military service. King Philip VI, upon receiving reports that 2 of his most powerful vassals were preparing for actual warfare over livestock management, reportedly threw his crown across the throne room and declared that he was seriously considering abdication in favor of someone better qualified to deal with this level of organized insanity. His advisors managed to talk him out of retirement, but only after pointing out that abandoning the throne during a goose crisis would probably not improve his historical reputation. The papal court, meanwhile, was watching these developments with a mixture of horror and fascination. On one hand, they couldn't be seen endorsing warfare over such trivial matters. On the other hand, the precedent of secular authorities attacking religious figures and their blessed animals could have serious implications for church authority throughout Europe. This escalation wasn't just about wounded pride or territorial disputes. It represented a fundamental breakdown in the systems that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of crisis. The Meadow incident revealed that medieval conflict resolution mechanisms were about as effective as using a chocolate teapot to serve actual tea. The feudal system was designed around the assumption that reasonable men could resolve their differences through established channels, overlords mediating disputes between vassals, church courts handling religious matters, and royal authority providing final arbitration when all else failed. But the goose crisis had managed to circumvent every single one of these safeguards by creating a situation that was simultaneously a property dispute, a religious conflict, a question of feudal loyalty, and a matter of international law. What made this particularly dangerous was that both sides had legitimate grievances according to different legal frameworks. Duke William really did have traditional property rights that were being violated. Count Thierry really was defending religious institutions that deserve protection. Brother Aldrich really had been performing legitimate religious ceremonies. And even Hugo and Jang had been following their orders as they understood them. This meant that neither side could back down without admitting that their understanding of law, honor, and proper governance was fundamentally flawed. In a political system based on personal reputation and inherited authority, such admissions were essentially career suicide. Both William and Thierry had painted themselves into corners where victory was the only acceptable outcome, regardless of how ridiculous the original cause might seem to outside observers. The broader implication was terrifying. If the medieval political system could be derailed this easily by a single wandering goose, what would happen when it faced real challenges? The plague was already beginning to spread through Mediterranean trade routes. English claims to French territory were creating international tensions, and various succession disputes were brewing throughout Europe. If European leaders couldn't resolve a livestock dispute without resorting to warfare, how could they possibly handle genuinely serious crises? Medieval Europe was about to find out whether its civilization was robust enough to survive its own bureaucratic absurdity, and the early signs were not encouraging. Around the main drama of dueling nobles and displaced waterfowl, a colorful cast of secondary characters emerged, each contributing their own special brand of medieval madness to the growing crisis. These weren't just random bystanders. They were active participants in what was rapidly becoming the most elaborately documented livestock dispute in European history. First, meet Dame Isabel de Courcy, the Duke's sister-in-law and arguably the only person in the entire conflict with any common sense. Dame Isabel had the misfortune of being both intelligent and related to people who were preparing for war over a goose, which put her in the uniquely medieval position of trying to talk sense into heavily armed men whose honor had been wounded by waterfowl. Her attempts at diplomatic intervention included hosting dinner parties where she seated representatives from both sides at the same table, organizing hunting expeditions that she hoped would remind everyone that there were plenty of other animals to worry about, and at one point, actually purchasing a flock of geese and donating them to a neutral monastery in hopes of demonstrating that the world's goose supply was not, in fact, limited to Marguerite. Her efforts were undermined by her own husband, Sir Geoffrey de Courcy, who had somehow convinced himself that the goose crisis was actually an elaborate French plot to test Norman loyalty. Sir Geoffrey spent most of the conflict writing increasingly paranoid letters to anyone who would listen, explaining his theory that Brother Aldrich was actually a French spy. Marguerite was a coded signal for enemy agents, and the whole incident was designed to distract Norman forces while the French prepared a surprise attack. His evidence for this theory consisted entirely of the fact that he couldn't think of any other reason why people would fight about a goose, which he considered ironclad proof of foreign involvement. Then there was Master Thomas the Chronicler, a monk from a different monastery who had been commissioned to write the official history of the conflict. Thomas approached this task with the dedication of a modern investigative journalist and the analytical skills of a medieval theologian, which resulted in a 400-page manuscript that included detailed genealogies of everyone involved, extensive theological analysis of the spiritual significance of waterfowl, and a complete breakdown of the legal precedents for animal-related warfare dating back to ancient Rome. His chronicle became the definitive source for the goose crisis, though historians still debate whether his claim that Marguerite was divinely inspired to test the faith of mortal rulers was serious theological analysis or just really elaborate sarcasm. Perhaps the most tragic figure was Sir Philippe the Younger, a knight in Count Thierry's service who took the sacred geese protection mandate so seriously that he began seeing religious significance in every bird he encountered. Sir Philippe started blessing chickens, conducting funeral services for dead sparrows, and at one point attempted to recruit a family of ducks into what he called his Holy Waterfowl Brigade. His fellow knights initially thought this was an elaborate joke, but Philippe's commitment to avian spirituality was absolutely genuine. He spent his own money commissioning tiny suits of armor for geese, wrote devotional poetry about the theological implications of egg-laying, and eventually founded what may have been Europe's first animal sanctuary, though he called it a sacred fowl fortress for the defense of divine creatures. The conflict also produced Father Benedict the Peacemaker, a papal representative who arrived with instructions to mediate the dispute, and discovered that medieval diplomacy was significantly more complicated than his training had led him to expect. Father Benedict's attempts at conflict resolution included organizing joint prayer services that ended in arguments about proper hymns for waterfowl, hosting theological debates about whether animals could be saints. The answer was apparently maybe, but only on weekends, and drafting what may have been history's first international treaty specifically addressing poultry rights. His final report to the Pope allegedly included the phrase, "I have seen the future of church diplomacy, and it involves way more geese than I expected." But perhaps the most important supporting character was Marguerite herself, who remained blissfully unaware of her starring role in this medieval soap opera. While humans fought over her theological significance and legal status, Marguerite continued her simple routine of eating, sleeping, and being generally goose-like. Contemporary accounts describe her as uncommonly placid for a creature of such divine importance, and note that she seemed to enjoy the attention, though whether this represented spiritual enlightenment or just normal goose behavior remained a matter of scholarly debate. These weren't isolated incidents of medieval weirdness. They were all connected through the complex web of relationships, obligations, and sheer coincidence that made medieval politics so fascinatingly dysfunctional. The goose crisis had created a ripple effect that touched dozens of lives in ways that no one could have predicted. And that perfectly illustrated why medieval Europeans seemed incapable of having simple, straightforward conflicts. Take the curious case of the merchant's conspiracy, which wasn't actually a conspiracy, but got called one anyway, because medieval people loved a good conspiracy theory. The Merchant Guild of Bruges, still trying to navigate the political implications of goose-related trade policies, had hired a group of professional mediators to help resolve the crisis before it completely destroyed regional commerce. These mediators, led by a man named Master Andreas, who specialized in what he called diplomatic solutions for unusual circumstances, attempted to approach the problem from a purely practical standpoint. Their solution was brilliant in its simplicity. They would purchase Marguerite from Brother Aldrich, relocate her to a neutral monastery in a different region, and compensate both Duke William and Count Thierry for their trouble with a combination of cash payments and trade concessions. It was the kind of pragmatic compromise that should have ended the whole mess in a week. Instead, it created 3 new controversies. Brother Aldrich declared that selling Marguerite would be simony, the sin of buying and selling holy things, and refused to consider any monetary transaction involving a blessed goose. Duke William interpreted the merchant's offer as proof that they considered his property rights negotiable, which he found deeply insulting. And Count Thierry decided that relocating Marguerite would be equivalent to exile for political dissent, making the merchant's accessories to religious persecution. The mediators' attempts to clarify their proposal only made things worse. Master Andrews explained that they weren't buying a sacred animal. They were purchasing custodial responsibilities for ecclesiastical livestock, which somehow managed to offend everyone involved while satisfying no one. The merchants found themselves accused of everything from heresy to treason, and Master Andreas reportedly went home to Bruges and took up a much safer profession: money lending to kings during wartime. Meanwhile, the conflict had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The University of Bologna, hearing about the legal complexities involved, dispatched a team of law students to study the case as part of their education in international jurisprudence. These students, led by a professor named Magistrate Lorenzo, who collected unusual legal precedents the way other people collected coins, saw the goose crisis as a perfect example of how multiple legal systems could interact in wonderfully complicated ways. The students' presence added a new dimension to the conflict because they kept asking questions that no one had thought to ask before. Why did ecclesiastical property rights extend beyond monastery grounds? What was the legal difference between a blessed animal and a regular animal? Could a goose be considered a legal person under canon law? Did property disputes involving religious figures fall under secular or religious jurisdiction? And perhaps, most importantly, what would happen if Marguerite died of natural causes while the case was still being litigated? These questions led to what became known as the Great Theological Debate of 1347, a scholarly discussion that attracted participants from across Europe and lasted for 3 months. The debate covered everything from the nature of divine blessing to the legal status of animal souls, and produced enough written material to fill a small library. The final conclusion was that the case was unprecedented in European law and would require entirely new legal frameworks to resolve properly, which was basically a 500-page way of saying, we have no idea what we're doing. The debate also attracted the attention of various fringe religious groups who saw the goose crisis as confirmation of their particular theological theories. A sect called the Brothers of Universal Salvation claimed that Marguerite's wandering proved that God intended all property to be held in common. A group of Reformed hermits declared that the conflict demonstrated the spiritual superiority of animals over humans. And one particularly creative heretical movement suggested that the entire crisis was a sign that the end times were approaching and that faithful Christians should prepare for the second coming by building arks specifically designed for waterfowl. Transportation. To understand how a single goose could cause this level of chaos, you have to understand what daily life was like in 14th century France, where people's relationship with animals was simultaneously more intimate and more mystical than anything we experience today. Medieval Europeans lived in a world where the line between the natural and supernatural was constantly blurred, where every unusual event might be a divine sign, and where the behavior of animals was considered a legitimate source of information about God's intentions for humanity. This wasn't primitive superstition. It was a coherent worldview based on centuries of Christian theology, mixed with folk traditions that went back to pre-Roman times. Medieval people believed that God communicated through creation, that animals possessed spiritual significance beyond their practical utility, and that the natural world was full of symbols that could be read by those with sufficient faith and wisdom. In this context, a wandering goose wasn't just livestock with poor property recognition skills. It was potentially a messenger from God, a test of human virtue, or a sign of divine displeasure with human behavior. The average medieval peasant lived in much closer contact with animals than modern people do. Families shared their living spaces with livestock during winter months for warmth. Children grew up alongside farm animals and often developed emotional attachments to creatures that were also economic necessities. Death and birth were constant presences in daily life, and the health of animals often determined whether human families would survive the winter. In this environment, the difference between a blessed animal and a regular animal wasn't just theological hair-splitting. It had real, practical implications for how people related to the creatures that shared their lives. Medieval religious life was also much more integrated into daily activities than modern religion tends to be. People blessed their tools, their crops, their homes, and yes, their animals as a matter of routine. Religious festivals often involved animal processions, blessing ceremonies, and rituals designed to ensure divine protection for livestock. The idea that a monk might bless his geese wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that one of those geese had wandered into the middle of an international political crisis. Social hierarchies in medieval society were rigid, but also weirdly flexible. When it came to religious matters, a peasant's pig could theoretically be considered more sacred than a nobleman's horse if the pig had been properly blessed and the horse hadn't. This created opportunities for social tension that didn't exist in purely secular contexts. Religious authority could potentially override social status, which made nobles nervous and gave commoners occasional leverage in disputes with their superiors. The medieval economy was also much more localized than modern economies, which meant that disruptions to trade routes or agricultural production had immediate, visible effects on daily life. When the goose crisis began affecting regional commerce, it wasn't just an abstract political problem. It was something that ordinary people could see in higher prices, delayed shipments, and merchants who suddenly needed armed escorts to travel between towns that had been safe for generations. Perhaps most deliciously ironic was the fact that while Duke William and Count Thierry were preparing for war over the principle of proper animal management, both of their territories were experiencing actual practical problems with livestock that they were completely ignoring. Duke William's own domains were dealing with an outbreak of sheep disease that was decimating flocks throughout Normandy, but he was too busy defending his theoretical authority over goose grazing to address the real agricultural crisis affecting his subjects. Count Thierry, meanwhile, had positioned himself as the great defender of sacred animals, while his own knights were notorious for their hunting excesses. Thierry's court regularly hosted elaborate hunting parties that killed hundreds of deer, wild boar, and game birds for sport. But apparently mass slaughter of wildlife for entertainment was perfectly consistent with protecting the theological rights of one particular goose. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but medieval nobles had developed an impressive capacity for ignoring contradictions when it served their political purposes. Brother Aldrich, who had started the whole mess by claiming his geese were divinely guided, seemed to have forgotten that divine guidance presumably included respecting human property rights and civil authority. His interpretation of God's will was suspiciously aligned with his personal desire to let his birds graze wherever they pleased, which suggested that either God had very specific opinions about meadow management or Brother Aldrich was projecting his own preferences onto divine providence. The legal scholars who were analyzing the case with such academic rigor were dealing with a situation that had been created by people's complete failure to follow existing laws and customs. They were developing elaborate new legal frameworks to address a problem that could have been solved in 5 minutes if everyone involved had just followed the rules that already existed. It was like watching someone build a catapult to open a door when they could have just turned the handle. Most ironic of all was that Marguerite herself remained the only party to the dispute, who was actually behaving reasonably. While humans fought over her theological significance, legal status, and symbolic meaning, she continued doing exactly what geese were supposed to do: eating grass, laying eggs, and generally being a productive member of agricultural society. In a conflict full of people acting like animals, the actual animal was the only one displaying human-like common sense. Everything changed when Marguerite laid an egg. Not just any egg, an egg that would become the most theologically significant piece of poultry produced in medieval European history. The date was November 15th, 1347, and the location was naturally the disputed meadow that had become the epicenter of international goose diplomacy. Brother Aldrich had been conducting his daily blessing ceremony from a safe distance, having learned his lesson about armed interventions, when Marguerite decided to demonstrate her reproductive capabilities right in the middle of what was technically Duke William's property. This seemingly simple biological function immediately created a legal nightmare that made the original grazing dispute look like a minor disagreement over table manners. Who owned the egg? Was it Duke William's property because it had been laid on his land? Did it belong to Brother Aldrich as the owner of the goose? Could Count Thierry claim it as part of his protection of sacred animals? Was the egg itself blessed by virtue of coming from a holy goose, or did it require separate sanctification? And perhaps most importantly, what were the theological implications of a sacred bird reproducing on disputed territory? The discovery of the egg sparked what historians would later call the Great Scholastic Panic of 1347. Legal scholars throughout Europe began frantically searching ancient texts for precedents involving the ownership of blessed animal offspring. Canon lawyers debated whether ecclesiastical property rights extended to future generations of sacred creatures. Secular courts argued about whether territorial sovereignty included jurisdiction over things that hadn't existed when the original property rights were established. The timing couldn't have been worse for everyone involved. Duke William had just finished mobilizing his full military force and was preparing for what he confidently expected to be a brief, decisive campaign to establish his authority over wandering waterfowl. Count Thierry had completed his own military preparations and was looking forward to a glorious victory in defense of religious freedom and divine creatures. Both sides had invested enormous amounts of time, money, and prestige in this conflict, and neither was psychologically prepared to deal with the possibility that the dispute might become even more complicated. But the egg changed everything because it represented the future. This wasn't just about one goose anymore. It was potentially about an entire dynasty of sacred waterfowl. If Marguerite's offspring inherited her blessed status, and if they continued to wander freely across territorial boundaries, the current crisis could extend indefinitely into the future. Medieval nobles, who were already dealing with inheritance disputes that lasted for generations, suddenly realized they might be looking at a goose-related conflict that could continue for centuries. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Duke William, who had been confident in his ability to resolve a simple property dispute through military action, was confronted with the possibility that military victory might actually make his problems worse. Count Thierry, who had positioned himself as the defender of sacred animals, realized that successful protection of Marguerite might obligate him to protect an unlimited number of her descendants. And Brother Aldrich, who had been certain that divine providence was on his side, began to wonder if God's plan might be more complicated than he had originally assumed. The transformation from military crisis to theological puzzle began with what became known as the Council of Confused Clergy. Archbishop Benedict, still smarting from his previous diplomatic failures, convened an emergency meeting of religious authorities to determine the spiritual status of Marguerite's egg. The council included bishops, abbots, university theologians, and papal representatives, along with a handful of legal experts who specialized in property law and several natural philosophers who were supposed to provide scientific context for the biological aspects of divine reproduction. The debates were immediately and spectacularly derailed by fundamental disagreements about the nature of blessing itself. Did divine favor transfer automatically from parent to offspring like inherited titles? Was each creature blessed individually through direct divine intervention? Could blessing be diluted by reproduction, like wealth divided among multiple heirs? The theological implications were staggering, and the practical applications were even worse. One faction, led by Bishop Reginald of Amiens, argued that blessing was inheritable, and that Marguerite's offspring would be automatically sacred from the moment of hatching. This position had the advantage of theological consistency, but the disadvantage of potentially creating an unlimited number of holy geese with special legal protection. Another group, headed by Abbot William of Cluny, insisted that each animal required individual sanctification and that the egg was simply a regular egg until properly blessed by appropriate religious authorities. A third faction, consisting mainly of university-trained theologians who enjoyed making simple problems more complicated, proposed that the egg existed in a state of potential blessing that would only be activated by specific ritual procedures performed at the moment of hatching. This theory required the development of entirely new theological frameworks for understanding the relationship between divine grace and avian reproduction, which was exactly the kind of academic challenge that medieval scholars lived for and everyone else found completely maddening. Meanwhile, resistance to the escalating complexity was growing among the people who would actually have to implement whatever solutions the clergy developed. Sir Hugo, the guard who had been involved in the original Meadow incident, reportedly declared that he was willing to fight human enemies for his duke, but drew the line at keeping theological records for baby geese. Several of Duke William's other knights began expressing similar concerns about the practical implications of policing sacred wildlife populations. Count Thierry's forces were experiencing their own crisis of confidence. Sir Philippe the Younger, who had taken goose protection so seriously, was having a complete psychological breakdown over the possibility that he might be responsible for the spiritual welfare of an entire flock of blessed birds. His attempts to prepare proper accommodations for potentially sacred goslings had consumed most of his personal wealth and all of his mental stability. Other knights in Thierry's service were beginning to question whether they had signed up for military service or wildlife management careers. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dame Isabel de Courcy, who had been quietly observing the theological debates while everyone else was arguing about the metaphysical implications of egg ownership. Her intervention was characteristically direct and devastatingly practical. She pointed out that while the men were debating the spiritual status of potential goslings, no one had bothered to determine whether the egg was actually fertile. This observation created what can only be described as the most awkward moment in medieval diplomatic history. Here were some of the most powerful men in France, along with the region's most distinguished religious authorities, having spent weeks preparing for war over the theological implications of goose reproduction without taking the elementary step of checking whether reproduction was actually occurring. The egg examination was conducted by Brother Thomas, the monastery's designated expert on poultry husbandry, under the supervision of representatives from all interested parties. The procedure involved carefully candling the egg to determine whether it contained a developing embryo or was simply an unfertilized shell. The tension in the room was reportedly so thick that several witnesses later claimed they had difficulty breathing during the process. Brother Thomas's verdict was delivered with the solemnity appropriate to a pronouncement that could determine the fate of nations. The egg was fertile, contained a healthy developing gosling, and would likely hatch within 2 weeks. This meant that the Paliand and theoretical theological debates were about to become very practical administrative problems. Dame Isabel's intervention had forced everyone to confront the reality that they would soon be dealing with an actual baby goose with potentially sacred status and uncertain legal ownership. The psychological impact of this revelation was immediate and transformative. The abstract theological exercise had suddenly become a concrete deadline. In 2 weeks, there would be a gosling that someone would have to take responsibility for, and that responsibility would need to be defined in terms that both secular and religious authorities could accept. The new situation required completely different approaches to what everyone had assumed was a straightforward conflict. Duke William, who had been preparing for a military campaign, suddenly found himself needing expertise in animal husbandry, religious law, and child-rearing techniques for waterfowl. His war council meetings began including discussions of proper nutrition for baby geese, appropriate housing for potentially sacred animals, and the legal implications of godparent-like responsibilities for blessed goslings. Count Thierry faced similar challenges, but from the opposite perspective. His position as protector of sacred animals now potentially included responsibility for ensuring the proper upbringing of a creature that might be divinely significant. His advisors were frantically researching precedents for the religious education of blessed animals, the appropriate ceremonies for welcoming holy offspring into the world, and the diplomatic protocols for announcing the birth of sacred goslings to foreign governments. Brother Aldrich, meanwhile, was discovering that being the caretaker of one famous goose was complicated enough, but being responsible for an entire family of potentially blessed waterfowl was a full-time administrative nightmare. He needed to develop policies for naming sacred goslings, procedures for determining their individual spiritual status, and protocols for managing what might become a permanent community of holy geese with international diplomatic significance. The legal establishment was forced to confront the reality that their elaborate theoretical frameworks would need to produce actual, workable solutions within a very limited time frame. Master Thomas the Chronicler found himself transitioning from historian to policy developer as various authorities asked him to draft practical guidelines for gosling management based on his extensive research into medieval animal law. The University of Bologna's law students were pressed into service as consultants for developing new legal frameworks that could be implemented immediately rather than debated for decades. Perhaps most importantly, the impending hatching forced all parties to recognize that their conflict had evolved far beyond its original parameters. This wasn't just about property rights or religious authority. Anymore, it was about creating sustainable systems for managing an unprecedented situation that would likely continue for years. The adversarial approach that had characterized the early phases of the dispute was clearly inadequate for addressing the complex, ongoing administrative challenges they were about to face. The shift in perspective was reflected in the language people used to describe the situation. Instead of the goose crisis or the meadow incident, participants began referring to the sacred fowl administration or the blessed animal management project. Military terminology gave way to bureaucratic vocabulary, and war councils evolved into planning committees. This linguistic evolution reflected a deeper psychological change. The participants were beginning to accept that they were involved in something unprecedented that would require new forms of cooperation rather than traditional forms of competition. The adversarial dynamics that had driven the early conflict were being replaced by collaborative problem-solving approaches, partly because the practical challenges were too complex for any single party to handle alone. The new reality also required different types of expertise. Military leaders found themselves consulting with monastery librarians about proper care for religious animals. Legal scholars were interviewing farmers about the practical aspects of goose husbandry. Religious authorities were negotiating with secular administrators about the day-to-day management of potentially sacred creatures. The traditional boundaries between different types of knowledge were breaking down under the pressure of having to solve an actually unprecedented problem. Was this change positive or negative? The answer depended entirely on your perspective and what you considered more important: maintaining traditional authority structures or solving practical problems through innovative cooperation. From Duke William's point of view, the shift represented a dangerous erosion of clear hierarchical relationships in favor of messy, collaborative arrangements that blurred the lines between secular and religious authority. He had started this conflict to establish his unquestioned control over his territory, and was ending up as part of a committee responsible for the welfare of sacred waterfowl. Count Thierry had similar concerns, but from the opposite angle. His original goal had been to demonstrate his role as protector of religious institutions and divine creatures, but the new arrangements required him to share that protection with secular authorities and administrative bureaucrats. Instead of being the heroic defender of sacred animals, he was becoming a co-administrator in a complex management structure that included people who couldn't tell the difference between a blessing and a recipe. From Brother Aldrich's perspective, the changes were largely positive because they provided institutional support for the care of his sacred geese while relieving him of sole responsibility for resolving the impossible legal and political complications that his birds had created. But he was also concerned about the bureaucratization of what he considered fundamentally spiritual relationships. The elaborate administrative frameworks being developed seemed to miss the essential point that these were blessed creatures whose significance transcended human legal categories. The short-term effects were clearly beneficial in terms of preventing actual warfare over poultry management, but the long-term implications were much less clear. The precedents being established would inevitably influence how future disputes involving religious property, animal rights, and territorial sovereignty were handled. Some observers worried that the collaborative approaches being developed might undermine traditional authority structures in ways that would create more problems than they solved. Others argued that the crisis had revealed fundamental weaknesses in existing systems that needed to be addressed anyway, and that the creative solutions being developed represented genuine improvements in how complex multi-jurisdictional disputes could be managed. The forced cooperation between secular and religious authorities was producing new forms of institutional coordination that might prove valuable for addressing other challenging problems. Most contemporary observers agreed that whatever else happened, European diplomacy would never be quite the same after the Goose Crisis. Though whether that was good or bad remained a matter of heated debate in the months and years that followed the Great Egg Crisis of November 1347. The medieval world discovered that solving unprecedented problems often creates even more unprecedented problems, just with better documentation and more committees involved. The Gosling, officially named Gabriel by Brother Aldrich, though Duke William insisted on calling him Norman and Count Thierry preferred Defender, hatched successfully on November 29, 1347. in the presence of representatives from 3 different legal systems, 2 competing military forces, and 1 very nervous monk who was beginning to realize that his simple life of prayer and poultry care had evolved into something resembling a medieval version of international diplomacy. The birth itself was anticlimactic in the way that most long-anticipated events are. Gabriel emerged from his shell looking exactly like every other gosling in the history of geese. Small, yellow, fluffy, and completely unaware that his existence had nearly triggered a war. The assembled dignitaries, who had spent weeks preparing elaborate ceremonies for welcoming a potentially sacred waterfowl into the world, found themselves standing around a basket watching a baby bird take its first steps, while everyone tried to figure out what they were supposed to do next. The immediate challenge was determining Gabriel's spiritual status. Brother Aldrich insisted that blessing was hereditary and that Gabriel was automatically sacred. The theological committee that had been studying the question for weeks announced that they needed more time to observe the gosling's behavior before making any determinations about divine favor. Duke William declared that whatever Gabriel's spiritual status, he was still hatched on Norman territory and therefore subject to Norman law. Count Thierry argued that any offspring of a protected animal deserved continued protection regardless of territorial considerations. The practical result was that Gabriel became probably the most carefully supervised baby goose in European history. His daily activities were monitored by representatives from multiple jurisdictions. His feeding schedule was approved by committee, and his playground, a carefully fenced area of the disputed meadow, was patrolled by guards from both armies who had transitioned from preparing for war to providing security for waterfowl recreational activities. Within 6 months, the original crisis had spawned an entire bureaucratic apparatus dedicated to what everyone was now calling Sacred Animal Administration. The Committee for the Management of Blessed Creatures included religious authorities, legal experts, military representatives, and agricultural specialists. They met weekly to discuss Gabriel's progress, monthly to review policies for handling similar situations, and quarterly to produce detailed reports for their various superiors, who were all desperately hoping this would eventually become someone else's problem. The financial costs were staggering. Duke William was spending more money on goose-related administrative expenses than he typically allocated for border defense. Count Thierry's budget for religious animal protection services had grown to rival his expenditures on conventional military operations. The monasteries involved were discovering that caring for internationally significant waterfowl required resources they had never anticipated needing. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. The participants had started this conflict as adversaries fighting over principles and were ending up as reluctant colleagues, trying to manage an ongoing administrative challenge that none of them fully understood, and all of them were stuck with for the foreseeable future. The evolution of the goose crisis attracted a new generation of medieval professionals who specialized in exactly the kind of complex, multi-jurisdictional problems that traditional authorities were completely unprepared to handle. These weren't the hereditary nobles or established religious figures who had dominated the early phases of the conflict. They were specialists, consultants, and administrators who had built their careers around solving problems that no one had previously imagined could exist. Enter Master William de Montpellier, who had earned a reputation as the foremost expert in what he modestly called unusual legal frameworks for exceptional circumstances. Master William had previously handled cases involving haunted property disputes, inheritance claims by people who had been declared dead but weren't, and a memorable incident involving a pig that had allegedly learned to write. His approach to the goose situation was refreshingly practical. He didn't care about the theological implications or the political symbolism. He just wanted to develop workable procedures for managing sacred waterfowl that all parties could live with. His solutions were characteristically creative and completely lacking in traditional medieval dignity. He proposed a rotating custody arrangement where Gabriel would spend different seasons with different caretakers, a system of shared financial responsibility for sacred animal maintenance costs, and detailed protocols for determining the spiritual status of future blessed creature offspring. His legal documents included provisions for everything from dietary requirements for holy geese to procedures for handling diplomatic visits from foreign dignitaries who wanted to see internationally famous waterfowl. Then there was Sister Margaret, the practical, a nun from a progressive monastery who had developed innovative approaches to agricultural management and had been recruited specifically to handle the day-to-day care of Gabriel and his mother. Sister Margaret brought a level of professional competence to sacred animal management that was desperately needed but completely unprecedented. She implemented feeding schedules, health monitoring systems, and enrichment activities for geese who were receiving more attention than most. Medieval children taught her innovations included the world's first systematic approach to documenting the behavior of blessed animals, partly for theological research and partly because everyone involved realized they had no idea what they were doing and needed some kind of evidence-based approach to figure it out. Sister Margaret's daily reports on Gabriel's activities became required reading for the Committee for the Management of Blessed Creatures and influenced policy decisions throughout the region. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis attracted the attention of Master Robert, the translator, a scholar who specialized in making complex legal and theological concepts understandable to people who actually had to implement them. Master Robert's job was essentially to translate between the elaborate theoretical frameworks developed by legal scholars and theologians and the practical needs of guards, farmers, and administrators who were responsible for actually taking care of sacred geese on a daily basis. His work resulted in what may have been medieval Europe's first user-friendly instruction manual for supernatural animal management. The Practical Guide to Blessed Creature Care included everything from feeding recommendations to emergency procedures for handling theological crises involving divine waterfowl. It became the standard reference for similar situations throughout Europe and was reportedly copied and distributed as far away as the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine court. These new professionals brought different perspectives and skills to problems that had previously been handled through traditional approaches based on inherited authority and established precedent. They were problem solvers rather than tradition maintainers, and their involvement marked a significant shift in how complex medieval disputes were managed. Their success in developing workable solutions for the goose crisis would influence approaches to similar problems for decades to come. But some problems persisted despite all the administrative innovation and collaborative problem-solving. The fundamental tensions between different legal systems, competing claims to authority, and incompatible worldviews didn't disappear just because everyone was working together more effectively. They just got buried under layers of bureaucratic procedures and diplomatic courtesy that made them less immediately explosive, but no less fundamentally problematic. The question of territorial sovereignty remained as murky as ever. Gabriel's daily wanderings across property boundaries continued to raise questions about whose law applied to blessed animals and whether spiritual authority superseded secular jurisdiction. The Committee for the Management of Blessed Creatures had developed elaborate protocols for handling these situations, but the protocols were essentially diplomatic workarounds rather than actual legal solutions. Everyone involved knew they were managing symptoms rather than addressing root causes. The financial arrangements were similarly unstable. The shared funding model for sacred animal care worked as long as all parties remained committed to the collaborative approach, but it depended on continued goodwill and political stability that couldn't be guaranteed. Duke William was already grumbling about the costs of supporting what he increasingly saw as an expensive religious project. Count Thierry was facing pressure from his own advisors who questioned whether protecting geese was the best use of military resources. And the monasteries were discovering that international fame for their waterfowl was attracting more attention and expense than they had bargained for. The theological questions that had sparked the original crisis remained largely unresolved. The committee had developed working definitions of blessed animal status and procedures for determining spiritual significance, but these were administrative conveniences rather than serious theological answers. Different religious authorities continued to hold fundamentally incompatible views about the nature of divine blessing, the spiritual status of animals, and the relationship between sacred and secular authority. The collaborative management structure allowed them to work together despite these disagreements, but it didn't resolve them. Perhaps most problematically, the success of the goose crisis management was inspiring copycat situations throughout Europe. Minor nobles, who had heard about the international attention and diplomatic importance generated by sacred animal disputes, began looking for opportunities to create their own blessed creature crises. Monasteries started claiming divine significance for their livestock in hopes of gaining special legal protections. Regional conflicts that had nothing to do with animals were being reframed as religious disputes involving sacred creatures because participants had noticed that such disputes attracted more high-level attention and resources. The proliferation of copycat sacred animal crises was creating a continent-wide problem that the collaborative approaches developed for the goose situation were not designed to handle. Each new case required custom administrative arrangements, specialized committees, and diplomatic negotiations that consumed enormous amounts of time and resources. European authorities were beginning to realize that they had accidentally created a system that incentivized people to manufacture religious crises involving animals as a way of gaining political leverage and international attention. The cyclical nature of these problems was becoming apparent to thoughtful observers. The administrative success of resolving the goose crisis through collaborative innovation was generating new conflicts that required even more administrative innovation to resolve. It was like watching someone become so good at putting out fires that they inadvertently created conditions that made fires more likely to start in the first place. Medieval Europe was discovering that solving unprecedented problems often meant creating new categories of unprecedented problems. And that successful crisis management could become a crisis in itself if it worked too well and encouraged too many people to create similar crises in hopes of receiving similar attention and resources. Compared to previous medieval conflicts over property rights, religious authority, and territorial sovereignty, the goose crisis represented both a radical departure from traditional approaches and a depressing confirmation of eternal human tendencies toward making simple problems incredibly complicated. Earlier disputes had typically been resolved through one of three methods: military victory by the stronger party, mediation by higher authorities, or exhaustion-induced compromise after everyone involved had wasted enormous amounts of time and money proving that they were right. The goose crisis broke this pattern by creating a situation where none of these traditional solutions were practical. Military victory was meaningless when the enemy was a goose and her offspring. Higher authorities were reluctant to get involved in a dispute that seemed simultaneously trivial and impossibly complex. An exhaustion-induced compromise wasn't possible when the problem required ongoing active management rather than a one-time settlement. What made the goose situation unique in medieval history was that it forced all parties to develop genuinely new approaches to conflict resolution rather than just applying existing frameworks more energetically. The collaborative administrative structures that emerged weren't based on traditional models of feudal hierarchy, religious authority, or royal mediation. They were improvised solutions designed specifically for managing unprecedented problems that crossed traditional jurisdictional boundaries, in some ways. This made the goose crisis a remarkably progressive development in medieval governance. The committees, shared funding arrangements, and diplomatic protocols that were developed represented genuine innovations in how competing authorities could work together to solve complex problems. These approaches would later influence how other multi-jurisdictional disputes were handled and contributed to the gradual development of more sophisticated diplomatic and administrative systems throughout Europe. But the goose crisis also confirmed some of the worst tendencies of medieval political culture. The ability of a minor livestock dispute to escalate into an international crisis demonstrated the fundamental instability of a political system based on personal honor and inherited authority. The enormous amounts of time, money, and intellectual energy that were devoted to resolving what was essentially a farm management problem showed how easily medieval priorities could become completely divorced from practical realities. The patterns that emerged during the goose crisis would repeat themselves in various forms throughout the later medieval period and beyond. Complex problems that crossed traditional boundaries would continue to generate administrative innovations and diplomatic solutions that worked reasonably well until they created new problems that required even more innovation and diplomacy to resolve. European civilization was developing an impressive capacity for managing increasingly complicated situations, while somehow never quite managing to prevent those situations from becoming complicated in the first place. The lessons that could be learned from the goose crisis were both encouraging and deeply disturbing. On one hand, it demonstrated that medieval institutions were more flexible and adaptive than they appeared, and that competing authorities could collaborate effectively when circumstances required it. On the other hand, it showed how easily rational people could become invested in fundamentally irrational conflicts, and how quickly administrative solutions could evolve into administrative problems that were worse than the original disputes. They were designed to resolve by the spring of 1349. Subtle but unmistakable signs pointed to the fact that Europe's brief golden age of sacred animal administration was about to come to a rather abrupt and unglamorous end. The warning signs were there for anyone paying attention, though most of the key players were too invested in their elaborate bureaucratic machinery to notice that the foundations of their entire system were beginning to crumble under the weight of both external pressures and their own administrative success. The first hint of trouble came from an unexpected source. Gabriel himself, who had grown from a carefully supervised gosling into a full-grown gander with opinions, territorial instincts, and what Sister Margaret diplomatically described as an independent spirit that may not be entirely compatible with committee-based management approaches. Gabriel had begun displaying distinctly uncooperative behavior toward his human administrators, including a disturbing tendency to bite members of the Committee for the Management of Blessed Creatures during their weekly supervisory visits. More troubling still, Gabriel showed no signs of the supernatural wisdom or divine favor that everyone had been expecting from a blessed goose. He was, by all observable measures, a perfectly normal bird who happened to eat more expensive food and receive more attention than any waterfowl in European history. The theological committee that had been monitoring him for signs of miraculous behavior was running out of ways to explain why a supposedly sacred animal spent most of his time doing exactly what regular geese did: eating, sleeping, making unpleasant noises, and leaving droppings in inconvenient places. The financial strain was becoming impossible to ignore. Duke William's accountants were producing increasingly desperate reports about the costs of maintaining the sacred animal administration, which had grown to include not just Gabriel and Marguerite, but also a growing collection of other potentially blessed creatures that various monasteries submitted for evaluation. The expense of feeding, housing, and providing security for what was essentially a medieval petting zoo was consuming resources that were needed for actual governance, military defense, and economic development. Count. Thierry was facing similar budgetary pressures, compounded by the fact that his role as protector of sacred geese had attracted attention from religious authorities throughout Europe, who kept sending him additional animals that they claimed required his protection. His castle was becoming a menagerie of allegedly holy livestock, and his knights were spending more time on animal husbandry than military training. Several of his most experienced officers had quietly requested transfers to other service positions that didn't involve theological discussions about the dietary requirements of blessed sheep. But perhaps most ominously, the copycat sacred animal. Crises that had proliferated throughout Europe were beginning to overwhelm the diplomatic and administrative systems that had been developed to handle them. Every week brought new reports of conflicts involving supposedly blessed pigs, sacred cattle, divine chickens, and holy horses. The University of Bologna's law school had been forced to establish an entire department dedicated to animal-related jurisprudence, and they were still falling behind on the caseload. The papal court, which had initially been supportive of the collaborative approaches developed during the Goose Crisis, was becoming increasingly concerned about the theological implications of treating every farm animal dispute as a potential religious crisis. Several influential bishops had begun questioning whether the proliferation of sacred animal claims was trivializing genuine religious authority and undermining the Church's credibility in matters of actual spiritual significance. The end came, not with the dramatic military confrontation that everyone had originally feared, but with the quiet collapse of a system that had become too complicated to sustain and too expensive to justify. The final blow was delivered by something that none of the elaborate committees, diplomatic protocols, or administrative innovations could address: the Black Death, which arrived in France in the summer of 1348 and reminded everyone that there were problems in the world that were significantly more serious than goose management. The plague's impact on the sacred animal administration was both immediate and comprehensive. Brother Aldrich, who had started the entire crisis by claiming his geese were divinely guided, was among the first casualties of the disease in his region. His death on August 15, 1308, created an immediate theological and administrative crisis. If the geese were truly blessed, why hadn't divine protection extended to their primary caretaker? And if Brother Aldrich's death meant that his claims about divine guidance were questionable, what did that say about the elaborate systems that had been built around those claims? The practical consequences were even more devastating than the theological ones. The monasteries that had been caring for sacred animals were struggling to maintain basic services for their human communities, let alone continue the elaborate care regimens that had been developed for blessed livestock. Sister Marguerite the Practical, who had become the acknowledged expert in supernatural animal management, found herself reassigned to plague relief work where her organizational skills were desperately needed for actually life-and-death situations. Duke William and Count Thierry, faced with the immediate crisis of trying to maintain order and provide basic services during a pandemic, discovered that they could no longer justify spending significant resources on goose-related diplomacy. Their final meeting, held in September 1348, was reportedly brief and pragmatic. According to contemporary accounts, the conversation went something like this. William: So, about the geese... Thierry: Yeah. William: People are dying of plague. Thierry: Right. William: Maybe we should focus on that? Thierry: Probably. William: What do we do with Gabriel? Thierry: Let him graze wherever he wants? William: Works for me. And with that anticlimactic exchange, the most elaborate diplomatic crisis in medieval European history was quietly abandoned in favor of dealing with problems that actually mattered. The Committee for the Management of Blessed Creatures held its final meeting on October 3, 1348. Though only 3 members attended and most of the agenda was devoted to discussing how to reallocate resources toward plague relief efforts. Gabriel and Marguerite, suddenly freed from their intensive supervision, reacted to their newfound independence by doing exactly what geese had always done. They wandered around, ate grass, and paid no attention whatsoever to human political boundaries. The disputed meadow that had been the epicenter of an international crisis became just another piece of pasture land, where some geese happened to graze sometimes. The elaborate legal frameworks that had been developed for managing sacred animal disputes were quietly filed away in monastery libraries and university archives, where they would occasionally be discovered by future scholars who would assume they were either elaborate jokes or evidence that medieval people were even stranger than previously thought. Master William de Montpellier's Practical Guide to Blessed Creature Care became a curiosity piece that was sometimes consulted by people dealing with unusual livestock problems, though never again for anything involving claims of divine blessing. The final symbolic end came in the winter of 1348, when Gabriel himself died of what appeared to be perfectly ordinary bird diseases, despite all the theological attention and medical care he had received. His death occasioned no diplomatic crisis, no theological controversy, and no administrative complications. He was buried in the monastery garden by a single monk who had known him as a gosling, and that was that. Marguerite lived for several more years, continuing her routine of wandering, grazing, and laying eggs that nobody paid any special attention to. She died sometime in 1351, though the exact date was unrecorded, because by then no one was keeping detailed records of sacred goose activities. The age of bureaucratized, supernatural animal management had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, and ultimately with the quiet recognition that there were more important things to worry about than the theological implications of waterfowl. Property rights. The sacred animal administration system collapsed for a combination of internal contradictions and external pressures that its creators had never anticipated, and its elaborate bureaucratic machinery was fundamentally incapable of addressing. At its core, the system had been built around the assumption that the problems it was designed to solve were the most important problems facing medieval society. But the arrival of the Black Death dramatically and permanently shifted everyone's priorities toward issues that were literally matters of life and death. The internal problems were equally fatal, though they developed more gradually. The collaborative administrative approach that had been hailed as an innovative solution to complex jurisdictional disputes turned out to work only as long as all parties remained equally invested in maintaining it. But as the costs mounted and the practical benefits remained unclear, that investment inevitably began to erode. Duke William had started the conflict to establish his authority over his property and ended up spending more time in committee meetings than actually governing his duchy. Count Thierry had sought to demonstrate his role as protector of religious institutions and found himself running what was essentially a very expensive zoo for allegedly holy animals. The theological foundations of the system were even shakier than the political ones. The elaborate theories about divine blessing, sacred animal status, and the spiritual significance of waterfowl had always been more convenient rationalizations than serious religious doctrine. When Brother Aldrich died and Gabriel failed to display any obviously supernatural characteristics, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the fiction that this was primarily a religious matter, rather than an administrative problem that had gotten completely out of hand. The economic factors were perhaps most decisive. The The sacred animal administration had grown from a simple property dispute into a continent-wide bureaucratic apparatus that consumed enormous resources while producing no obvious benefits beyond keeping various committees employed. In good times, when resources were plentiful and people had leisure to worry about theoretical problems, such elaborate systems could be sustained through a combination of political prestige and intellectual curiosity. But when the plague arrived and resources became scarce, spending money on goose management became an obviously absurd priority. The institutional factors were equally important. The collaborative structures that had been developed to manage the goose crisis were entirely dependent on the personal relationships and political agreements that had created them. Unlike traditional medieval institutions based on inherited authority or religious doctrine, the sacred animal administration had no independent source of legitimacy or stability. When the people who had created it were no longer able or willing to maintain it, it simply disappeared. Perhaps most fundamentally, the system ended because it had solved the wrong problem. The elaborate administrative machinery that had been developed was designed to manage the symptoms of medieval political dysfunction, the tendency for minor disputes to escalate into major conflicts, rather than address the underlying causes. It provided ways to manage complicated situations after they had become complicated, but it didn't prevent situations from becoming complicated in the first place. In fact, by demonstrating that complicated situations could attract significant attention and resources, it actually encouraged people to make their problems more complicated rather than simpler. The arrival of the Black Death revealed that all the diplomatic innovation and administrative creativity in the world couldn't substitute for good judgment about what actually mattered. When people were dying of disease, arguing about the theological status of geese seemed not just irrelevant but actively harmful, a waste of human talent and resources that were desperately needed for addressing real problems. The immediate aftermath of the sacred animal administration's collapse was characterized by a combination of relief, embarrassment, and determined collective amnesia among most of the people who had been involved. Duke William and Count Thierry, who had spent nearly 2 years locked in elaborate diplomatic negotiations over goose management, seemed to reach an unspoken agreement that the less said about the entire episode, the better. Their subsequent correspondence made no reference to sacred animals, blessed creatures, or theological waterfowl, though they did occasionally exchange practical information about plague, prevention, and economic recovery that suggested they had learned something about effective cooperation from their ridiculous shared experience. The short-term, practical consequences were generally positive, if only because resources that had been devoted to supernatural animal management were redirected toward more useful purposes. The monasteries that had been participating in the sacred creature evaluation process refocused their attention on traditional religious activities and charitable work related to plague relief. The knights who had been providing security for holy geese returned to more conventional military duties. The legal scholars who had been developing theoretical frameworks for animal-related jurisprudence turned their attention to the practical legal problems created by widespread death and social disruption. But stepping into the institutional vacuum left by the collapse of the sacred animal administration was a new generation of pragmatic administrators who had observed the entire goose crisis from the sidelines and had learned valuable lessons about what not to do when faced with complex multi-jurisdictional problems. These administrators, many of whom had been trained in the new universities that were developing more systematic approaches to governance and law, brought different perspectives to medieval bureaucracy that emphasized practical problem-solving over theoretical elegance. The most immediate institutional change was a widespread shift toward what contemporary sources called simplified dispute resolution, a conscious effort to handle conflicts through existing institutions rather than creating new bureaucratic machinery for each unprecedented situation. This represented a direct reaction against the administrative complexity that had characterized the goose crisis and reflected a newfound appreciation for the value of keeping simple problems simple. There were also immediate attempts at institutional revival, though these were generally unsuccessful. Several minor nobles who had been impressed by the international attention generated by the original goose crisis attempted to manufacture their own sacred animal disputes in hopes of gaining similar diplomatic prominence. But the changed political climate meant that such attempts were dismissed rather than dignified with elaborate administrative responses. The appetite for complex animal-related bureaucracy had been thoroughly exhausted by the original crisis. The papal court issued quiet instructions to religious authorities throughout Europe, discouraging the proliferation of sacred animal claims and emphasizing the importance of maintaining clear distinctions between genuine religious matters and administrative conveniences. While these instructions were diplomatically worded, their practical effect was to shut down most of the copycat sacred creature disputes that had been developing throughout the continent. Most tellingly, no one attempted to commemorate or celebrate the administrative innovations that had been developed during the goose crisis, despite their genuine creativity and collaborative success. The legacy of the Great Goose Crisis shaped medieval European diplomatic and administrative development in ways that its participants never intended, and that later generations would have found deeply embarrassing if they had fully understood what they were commemorating. The collaborative administrative structures that had been developed to manage sacred animal disputes became inadvertent prototypes for the more sophisticated bureaucratic systems that would eventually replace the chaos of feudal governance, though. The connection between goose management and modern administrative science was not one that medieval chroniclers chose to emphasize in their historical accounts. The most significant long-term impact was the establishment of precedents for multi-jurisdictional cooperation that transcended traditional feudal boundaries. The committees, shared funding arrangements, and diplomatic protocols that had been improvised to handle the goose crisis provided working models for how competing authorities could collaborate on complex problems without abandoning their fundamental claims to sovereignty. These approaches would later influence how territorial disputes, trade disagreements, and religious conflicts were managed throughout the later medieval period, though future diplomats were careful to avoid any explicit references to their waterfowl-related origins. Later generations of medieval administrators developed what historians would later recognize as the first systematic approaches to what we might now call crisis management, though they called it managing unusual circumstances because medieval people had more dignity than to admit they were developing entire governmental specializations around handling ridiculous situations. The professional administrators who emerged from the goose crisis brought new approaches to complex problem-solving that emphasized practical outcomes over theoretical elegance and collaborative solutions over adversarial confrontation. The legal precedents established during the crisis had profound implications for the development of European jurisprudence, though law schools were remarkably creative in finding ways to teach these precedents without mentioning their origins in livestock disputes. The innovative approaches to determining jurisdiction in cases involving multiple competing authorities became foundational principles for later developments in international law, diplomatic immunity, and interinstitutional cooperation. University law programs throughout Europe incorporated case studies based on the goose crisis into their curricula, though they usually disguised them as hypothetical scenarios involving disputed territories and conflicting claims, rather than admitting they were teaching students how to handle arguments about sacred geese. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis established the principle that unprecedented problems required unprecedented solutions rather than simply more vigorous application of existing approaches. This represented a fundamental shift in medieval thinking about governance and conflict resolution. Previous generations had assumed that traditional institutions and inherited wisdom were adequate for handling any situation that might arise. The Goose Crisis demonstrated that rapidly changing circumstances could create situations that existing frameworks were simply incapable of addressing, and that effective governance required the flexibility to develop new institutional approaches when circumstances demanded them. The administrative innovations that emerged from the crisis also influenced the development of record-keeping and documentation systems throughout medieval Europe. The elaborate bureaucratic machinery that had been created to manage sacred animal affairs generated unprecedented amounts of written documentation about decision-making processes, resource allocation, and interinstitutional cooperation. These records became models for how complex administrative operations could be documented and monitored, and they contributed to the gradual professionalization of medieval bureaucracy. The crisis also had unexpected influence on the development of medieval universities and scholarly institutions. The legal and theological questions raised by the Goose dispute attracted some of the most innovative thinkers of the era and resulted in new approaches to academic research and scholarly collaboration. The interdisciplinary cooperation that had been necessary to address the crisis, combining legal expertise, theological knowledge, agricultural science, and diplomatic skill, became a model for how complex intellectual problems could be approached through collaborative scholarly efforts. Most ironically, the Goose Crisis contributed to the development of more realistic approaches to conflict resolution by demonstrating just how absurd medieval political culture could become when left to its own devices. The spectacle of European nobles preparing for war over waterfowl served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal pride and theoretical principles to override practical common sense. Today, we can see remarkable echoes of the Great Goose Crisis in contemporary examples of how bureaucratic systems can evolve beyond their original purposes and create problems that are more complex than the issues they were designed to solve. The fundamental pattern: minor problem triggers administrative response. Administrative response creates new problems. New problems require more administration. And eventually, the administrative apparatus becomes more complicated and expensive. Then the original issue remains depressingly familiar to anyone who has observed modern institutional behavior. Consider the contemporary phenomenon of regulatory compliance in modern corporations, where companies often spend more money and human resources on documenting their compliance with various regulations than they do on the actual activities that the regulations were designed to govern. Like the medieval committees that spent enormous amounts of time and money managing the theological status of geese, modern organizations routinely develop elaborate administrative systems for tracking, reporting, and certifying their adherence to rules that may have made sense originally, but have evolved into bureaucratic exercises that serve mainly to justify their own existence. The parallels are particularly striking in the realm of environmental regulation, where well-intentioned efforts to protect natural resources have sometimes generated bureaucratic requirements that consume more resources than the environmental protection they accomplish. The modern practice of requiring environmental impact studies for minor development, projects that take longer to complete and cost more money than the projects themselves, bears an uncomfortable resemblance to the medieval requirement for theological committees to evaluate the spiritual status of farm animals. Sound familiar? The Goose Crisis also anticipated modern patterns of how media attention and political pressure can transform minor administrative issues into major political crises. In our current era of social media and 24-hour news cycles, we regularly see small incidents escalate into international controversies simply because they capture public attention and become symbols for larger political conflicts. The medieval pattern of local livestock disputes becoming matters of international diplomatic importance finds its modern equivalent in how minor cultural disagreements can become global political flashpoints when they get caught up in larger ideological conflicts. The proliferation of copycat sacred animal crises throughout medieval Europe after the success of the goose crisis management provides an eerily accurate preview of how modern institutional responses to unusual problems often create incentives for people to manufacture similar problems in hopes of receiving similar attention and resources. Contemporary examples include the tendency for successful advocacy campaigns to spawn multiple similar campaigns, the way innovative bureaucratic solutions often get replicated in contexts where they don't really apply, and the modern phenomenon of crisis entrepreneurship, where individuals and organizations create or exaggerate problems in order to position themselves as essential parts of the solution. The medieval discovery that collaborative administrative approaches could solve immediate problems while creating long-term institutional sustainability issues has obvious parallels in modern public-private partnerships, interagency task forces, and international cooperative agreements that work well initially, but become increasingly expensive and complicated over time. The modern tendency to respond to complex problems by creating new institutions rather than using existing ones mirrors the medieval approach to the goose crisis and often produces similar results. Short-term success followed by long-term administrative burden and institutional proliferation. Perhaps most tellingly, the medieval pattern of highly educated, well-intentioned people becoming so invested in theoretical frameworks and administrative procedures that they lose sight of practical realities continues to characterize many modern institutional responses to complex problems. The contemporary equivalent of medieval theologians debating the spiritual status of waterfowl can be found in academic conferences, policy think tanks, and consulting firms where brilliant people spend enormous amounts of time and intellectual energy developing sophisticated analytical frameworks for problems that could probably be solved more effectively through simple, direct action. The goose crisis also anticipated modern patterns of how institutional legitimacy can become divorced from practical effectiveness. The medieval sacred animal administration continued to operate and expand long after it had ceased to serve any useful purpose, sustained primarily by the institutional momentum and professional investments of the people involved in running it. This pattern of institutional persistence, despite practical irrelevance, remains one of the most consistent features of complex modern bureaucracies, from international organizations that continue to exist decades after their original purposes have been fulfilled to regulatory agencies that regulate problems that no longer exist while failing to address problems that do exist. Even now, the Great Goose Crisis influences multiple areas of modern academic study, policy development, and institutional design, though usually without explicit acknowledgement of its historical origins. Medieval historians regularly use the crisis as a case study in the evolution of European administrative systems, though they tend to focus on its institutional innovations rather than its fundamental absurdity. Political scientists who study conflict resolution and diplomatic negotiation often reference the collaborative approaches developed during the crisis as early examples of successful multi-party problem solving, though they usually frame their discussions in terms of medieval precedents for modern institutional cooperation rather than admitting they're analyzing goose management techniques. The crisis continues to influence academic study in ways that extend far beyond medieval history. Law schools use modified versions of the legal precedents established during the Goose Crisis to teach students about jurisdictional complexity and interinstitutional cooperation, though the case studies are usually presented as abstract hypothetical scenarios rather than historical incidents involving actual waterfowl. Business schools incorporate lessons from the crisis into their curricula on crisis management and collaborative leadership, focusing on how the medieval administrators successfully navigated competing stakeholder interests and resource allocation. Challenges under pressure. Popular culture has also found ways to incorporate elements of the goose crisis into contemporary narratives, though usually in heavily disguised forms. The basic plot structure: minor incident escalates into major crisis due to bureaucratic complexity and wounded pride, eventually collapsing under its own weight when real problems demand attention, has become a standard template for satirical commentary on modern institutional dysfunction. Political satire frequently echoes the fundamental dynamics of the goose crisis, though contemporary satirists probably don't realize they're following a narrative pattern that was established by medieval Europeans arguing about waterfowl. The crisis also influences contemporary approaches to institutional design and policy development in ways that are both positive and cautionary. Modern policymakers who are aware of the goose crisis proceeding often use it as an example of how well-intentioned collaborative solutions can evolve into bureaucratic monsters that consume more resources than the problems they were designed to solve. This awareness has contributed to the development of more skeptical approaches to institutional innovation and more systematic evaluation of whether bureaucratic solutions are actually improvements over simpler alternatives. Why people still care about the Great Goose Crisis nearly 7 centuries after it ended probably says more about enduring human nature than about the historical significance of medieval waterfowl management. The crisis remains compelling because it perfectly captures the human tendency to make simple problems complicated through overanalysis, institutional innovation, and the inability to admit that we might be taking ourselves too seriously. Looking back across the 2-year span of what historians have diplomatically termed the sacred animal administration period, we've seen how a simple case of wandering livestock managed to expose every single weakness in medieval European political culture, while simultaneously demonstrating both the impressive adaptability and the fundamental absurdity of human institutional behavior. The journey from Brother Aldrich's initial complaints about property rights to the collapse of an entire bureaucratic apparatus dedicated to goose management reads like a cautionary tale about what happens when people become so invested in being right that they forget to ask whether what they're being right about actually matters. The key patterns that emerged during this ridiculous saga remain depressingly relevant today. We witnessed how minor disputes can escalate into major crises when personal pride becomes more important than practical problem solving. We saw how intelligent, well-educated people can become so attached to theoretical frameworks that they lose sight of obvious practical solutions. We observed how institutional innovation can become an end in itself, creating bureaucratic systems that are more complex and expensive than the problems they were designed to address. Perhaps most significantly, we discovered how collaborative solutions that work in the short term can create long-term problems that are worse than the original disputes they were meant to resolve. The administrative machinery that was developed to manage the goose crisis represented genuine innovation in medieval governance and diplomacy, but it also created incentives for people to manufacture similar crises in hopes of receiving similar attention and resources. The success of the sacred animal administration in resolving immediate conflicts led directly to its failure as a sustainable institutional model. The most surprising discovery throughout this journey was probably how consistently human nature remained constant across centuries of technological and social change. Medieval nobles arguing about goose management displayed exactly the same psychological patterns that characterize modern politicians arguing about policy implementation. The same wounded pride, the same inability to admit mistakes, the same tendency to double down on failed approaches rather than acknowledge that simpler solutions might be more effective. The most important takeaway from the Great Goose crisis might be the recognition that institutional complexity is not necessarily a sign of institutional sophistication. The elaborate committees, diplomatic protocols, and administrative procedures that were developed to handle sacred animal disputes were impressive demonstrations of medieval organizational capability, but they were also symptoms of a political culture that had lost the ability to distinguish between problems that required complex solutions and problems that required simple ones. How our understanding of this period has evolved over the centuries also tells us something important about how people prefer to remember their institutional failures. Medieval chroniclers who documented the Goose Crisis were careful to emphasize its diplomatic innovations while downplaying its fundamental absurdity. Later historians have continued this tradition, focusing on the collaborative administrative techniques while treating the waterfowl-related origins as colorful historical details rather than central features of the story. This pattern of retroactive rationalization suggests that humans have always been more comfortable celebrating their bureaucratic creativity than acknowledging their bureaucratic dysfunction. Perhaps the most perfectly encapsulating anecdote from the entire Goose Crisis comes from the spring of 1349, just months before the whole system collapsed under the weight of plague and common sense. Master Thomas the chronicler, who had been documenting every detail of the sacred animal administration with obsessive thoroughness, received a visit from his nephew, a young man who had been studying at the University of Paris and was making his way home to visit family. The nephew arrived at the monastery to find his uncle frantically copying the latest reports from the Committee for the Management of Blessed Creatures, including detailed dietary logs for Gabriel, theological assessments of his spiritual development, and administrative projections for the long-term costs of maintaining a growing population of potentially sacred waterfowl. Master Thomas proudly showed his nephew the extensive archives he had compiled documenting every aspect of the Goose Crisis, explaining how this unprecedented situation was generating new approaches to international diplomacy, interinstitutional cooperation, and the theological significance of animal behavior. The nephew listened politely to this explanation, then asked the obvious question that apparently no one involved in the administration had thought to ask. "Uncle, why don't you just let the goose eat grass wherever it wants to eat grass?" "Master?" Thomas reportedly stared at his nephew for several minutes before responding that the question demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the complex legal, theological, and diplomatic principles involved in proper sacred animal management. The nephew's follow-up question, "But it's just a goose, right?" allegedly left Master Thomas speechless. This story, which Master Thomas included in his own chronicle with what historians interpret as either complete lack of self-awareness or sophisticated irony, perfectly captures why the entire Goose Crisis was simultaneously brilliant and completely insane. The administrative innovations that were developed to handle the situation were genuinely impressive examples of collaborative problem-solving and institutional creativity. The diplomatic protocols were sophisticated approaches to managing competing claims to authority. The theological frameworks were intellectually rigorous attempts to address unprecedented questions about the relationship between divine blessing and animal behavior. But underneath all this, institutional sophistication was a simple reality that everyone involved had somehow managed to forget. They were arguing about a goose, a single bird that wanted to eat grass and lay eggs and had no opinion whatsoever about the theological significance of territorial sovereignty or the diplomatic implications of ecclesiastical property rights. The entire elaborate apparatus of committees, protocols, and administrative procedures had been built around the assumption that this was a complex problem requiring complex solutions, when the actual problem could have been resolved by letting a goose be a goose. What this story reveals about the entire crisis is how easy it is for intelligent people to become so invested in the sophistication of their analytical frameworks that they lose track of the fundamental simplicity of the problems they're trying to solve. The medieval administrators who developed sacred animal management systems weren't stupid or incompetent. They were highly educated, experienced professionals who brought impressive intellectual resources to bear on what they perceived as a challenging institutional problem. But they had defined the problem in ways that made simple solutions impossible to see. And their very success in developing complex solutions made it even harder for them to step back and ask whether complex solutions were actually necessary. The nephew's questions weren't sophisticated or intellectually impressive, but they cut straight to the heart of what everyone else had been dancing around for 2 years. Sometimes the simplest explanation is that there isn't actually a complicated problem that needs solving. Just people who have convinced themselves that there is doubt. And so we come to the end of our journey through one of history's most elaborate exercises in missing the point. The Great Goose Crisis of 1347 to 1349 stands as a monument to the human capacity for turning simple situations into complex problems through the application of intelligence, creativity, and institutional innovation that would have been better applied to literally anything else. In the end, Marguerite got what she wanted all along: the freedom to graze wherever the grass was greenest, without regard for the arbitrary boundaries that humans had drawn across her world. Gabriel grew up, lived a normal goose life, and died without ever understanding that he had once been the center of international diplomatic attention. The meadow where it all began returned to being just another piece of countryside where geese sometimes wandered, and humans occasionally paused to appreciate the simple fact that grass grows, birds fly, and most problems are much smaller than we make them. Perhaps that's the most important lesson from this ridiculous medieval adventure. Sometimes the best solution to a complex problem is to remember that it doesn't actually have to be complex at all. Sometimes wisdom lies not in developing more sophisticated ways to analyze situations, but in having the courage to ask whether the situation really needs analyzing in the first place. The next time you find yourself in the middle of an elaborate institutional process designed to address what started as a simple problem, you might want to remember Marguerite the Goose, who solved the great diplomatic crisis of 1347 by doing exactly what geese have always done: ignoring human politics and eating grass wherever she found it. There's something deeply peaceful about that approach to life, and maybe something worth emulating. Rest easy, Marguerite. History remembers you not for the crisis you caused, but for the wisdom you never knew you possessed. Be understanding that sometimes the most profound response to human complexity is simply to be what you are, where you are, doing what you've always done. And that's enough. Sweet dreams, and may your own problems prove simpler than they first appear.